Hi everyone, welcome back to MEG Motors. Today we have something a little different from what we normally work on. We're going to be working on this dirt bike engine. This is a 2004 Honda CR125 engine. The owner brought this one to me. He bought the bike used and it was literally the proverbial basket case. The engine came mostly disassembled, and all the parts are in these two Dollar General bags. They didn't quite split the cases on it, which is a good thing, but the rest of it's all taken apart. We looked it over. It looks like the tip of the spark plug broke off and damaged the piston, and that's what caused the engine to stop running. But when we did an evaluation, the main bearings on the crankshaft are bad, and there's a little bit of play in the connecting rod. So we're gonna have to put a crankshaft in this engine, and so we're gonna go through that. We're gonna split the cases. We're gonna put a crankshaft in it, and we're gonna have to go through these bags and figure out what else might be missing or what else might be bad, and see if we can get this engine back together for the owner. So we're gonna take a quick walk through on this one before we get started, and I'll show you kind of what we have to work with, and then we'll get started on putting a crankshaft back in this engine. Now you'll have to excuse the workbench. It's a little bit of a mess right now. I got a couple projects going on, but here's our engine. Like I said, 2004 CR125. If you listen, hopefully this is going to come out on the camera. I'm going to turn the crankshaft. This should be nearly silent when you do this, but you're going to hear the main bearings, I hope, do a little grinding. Normally that rotation would be almost silent, and so the main bearings are definitely bad. And then there's just a little bit of play in the connecting rod. I don't know if that's coming out on camera or not, but I can feel just a little bit of play in the crankshaft, and so we're going to put a crankshaft in it for sure. We don't want to risk splitting the cases, putting in main bearings, and doing all that work. He's going to do a top end. We're going to put a new piston in it. We don't want to do all that work and then have this crankshaft turn out to be bad and fail on him shortly after he gets it back running. So like I said, here's the rest of the engine. It's literally in bags over here. Got our clutch over here. Here's our cylinder head. Like I said, it took a little damage. It looks like a spark plug tip broke off maybe, and got on top of the piston and hammered a little bit. That's why it quit running. It eventually seized the ring in the piston, so that it didn't run anymore. With our clutches in there, just a mix of parts in here, Kickstarter shaft, and so yeah, we're gonna have to go through this. Like I said, we'll put the crankshaft in first. I'm glad you didn't split the cases. Now we're gonna go ahead and split the cases, get the crank out, and put a new one in there, and then we'll go through the rest of these bags and see if we can put the rest of it together. We also have this situation going on, which is the output shaft. The previous owner, whoever he was, actually had welded the countershaft sprocket onto the shaft. And the splines on the output shaft are not in very good shape. But when we put the countershaft sprocket on the shaft, it feels like it still fits pretty tight. And we looked around for a shaft that's not available from Honda anymore, and the only way we can get one used is to buy a complete transmission, and the cheapest one we can find is $350 plus tax. And so the owner doesn't want to spend that much money on this bike to get it back together, so he wants to try to reuse this shaft. We ordered a new sprocket, and we're going to put a new sprocket on it and see how well it fits on the shaft, and hopefully it's going to fit well enough for this bike to still work. Like I said, the old one, when we put the old sprocket back on, it feels pretty secure, and so I'm not really sure why it was welded on before, but it was. And they had to, this is where they had to grind it to get it back off. So So anyway, that's kind of what we're working with. Let's get some tools out and we'll get started taking this case apart. I already have the new crankshaft here, so we'll be able to take this apart and put it right back together. All right, so like I said, this engine is mostly taken apart already. We have to still take the stator off, and on the other side, the primary drive gear, it's actually already loose, so that's just going to come off. Now we have a little bit of disassembly on the shift linkage, and then we'll be ready to split the cases. So let's go ahead and get this stator off first. Should just be these two bolts. Oh, yeah, that was pretty tight. And that should just pull out. Here we go. And then on the other side, like I said, our primary drive gear is already, the bolt's already loose. So we should be able to just pull this gear off. Oh, now it doesn't want to let loose. Those usually just slide right off. Hope we don't have some more damage in there. We also need to take the shift drum apart here. And so you want to be careful with this. You can definitely use an impact on this. I've done it many times. But you need to be sure that if you do use an impact, that the drum is turned all the way through the transmission until it hits the final stop. If it's in between gears, you risk damaging a fork, but once it's all the way, it can't really do any damage. The forks can't move anymore. And so I'm going to try to break it loose by hand, but I suspect we're going to have to put an impact on that. Yeah, there we go. All right, and then this bolt comes out and this little shift drum selector comes off. And the detent mechanism comes apart. All right, now we got to get this gear off. I'm gonna have to put a puller on it, I think, because it certainly doesn't want to come off. I'm gonna try some gentle persuasion. Yeah, it does not want to move. Like I said, that's pretty rare. Now let me get a puller and we'll see if we can pull that off. I don't know how stuck it is, so we're going to try this little two-jaw puller and see if we can get it to at least start off. I have a feeling if we can break it loose, it'll come right off. But we'll see. Well, it's coming off, but it's not coming off easy. Alright, so there's our primary gear. I don't know why that was on there so tight. And we got this is a collar. Hopefully that'll come off. doesn't seem to want to. So we're going to leave that in place right now. That's not going to hold the case together or anything. All right, so we're going to take all the screws out that hold the case together. All right, some people like to make a diagram and mark where each bolt comes out of when you take a case apart like this, because they are all different lengths. And when it comes time to put this back together, you have to get the right bolt in the right spot. But in my experience, they only fit together one way, and so I usually don't have too much trouble figuring out where they go. So I don't mark them. I just take them out. But if you feel the need to mark them, obviously go ahead. All right, and then we're going to use a tool called a case splitter. Once we're sure we have all the bolts out. All right, I've seen lots of videos online of people splitting cases, and everybody has their way to do it. Typically, they won't just pull apart. And I believe the correct way to take cases apart and put them together is to use case splitters and crank pullers to put them back together. And so that's what I'm going to use on this one. So this is a case splitter. It's basically another kind of a puller. And basically, it's going to sit right here. We're going to bolt it to the case. I'm going to try to find some relatively even spaced bolt pattern. And then when we tighten this bolt down, it's going to push against the end of the crankshaft and pull the cases apart. You don't ever want to like stick screwdrivers between the cases and try to pry them apart. If you do that, you'll damage the sealing surfaces, and it'll leak oil most likely when you get it all back together. All right, so with those snug down, we're gonna start tightening this center screw down. Get that centered on there. So you can see it's already started, the case have already started coming apart. All right, it seems to have they're binding up on the counter shaft a little bit. Actually binding up a lot. Now, normally at this point the cases would almost fall apart, but for some reason these cases don't seem to want to do that. Something's in a bind somewhere and I'm not sure what it is. Just recentering the tool on the crankshaft. There we go. Whatever was binding it seems to have let loose. So I believe this is loose. I'm going to take the tool off right now. The counter shaft is not going through its bearing like it should. So we're going to have to play with that a little bit to finish getting these cases apart. There we go. All right. And so here's our cases split. So this is one of the shift rods. This is what the shift forks ride on. And so this one came out. That's the next thing we needed to take off anyway. So we'll pull that. And when we pull that, we should be able to get these two shift forks off. And then there's another rod right here, gets this fork off, and then the drum comes out, the other fork. It's important you keep up with the washers on the ends of these shafts. Some have washers, some don't. And it's important that all of that goes back together correctly. So keep up with all of that. And then we're going to lift these two shafts out of the transmission. This one kind of came apart on us. So I've got a video out there that talks specifically about how motorcycle transmissions work. If you're curious about a deeper explanation about that, you can look there. But basically, we're going to look at these shift dogs on this transmission. We want to make sure that the edges are still nice and square, and we don't have any that are rounded off. And if they're rounded off badly enough, it can cause the transmission to jump out of gear. And so we don't want that. So we're going to look real close at those. And so far these all look good. So when the transmission shifts, these pieces right here will slam together, and so they can sometimes take wear. But these actually look really good. Don't see any damage to any of the gears. So I think we're good on our transmission. So yeah, hopefully you can hear this sound. This bearing feels horrible. Feels like it's full of dirt. All right, so the next thing we need to do in getting this apart is to press the crankshaft out of the other side of the case. And this is another collar that should have come off easily, but much like the primary gear, it doesn't seem to want to come off. So we're going to try to press it out of there. With our same press. Alright, so with our press tool in place, let's see if we can get that crankshaft to come out of there. Definitely moving. Unfortunately, we're only going to get to move it a short distance before the tool is going to bottom out on that spacer. I was hoping that it would break loose and come out easily without giving us too much more trouble, but again, it doesn't seem to want to do that. So we're going to put have to put the bolt back in the crankshaft to give us a little more pressing room. Bottomed out again. There we go. All right, so there's our crankshaft. Yeah, it feels a little rough and definitely has a little play in it. So, all right. And here's our spacer. I don't think there's anything wrong with the spacer. It feels like I can feel a little like sharp edge on the end of the crankshaft, like somebody somehow has damaged the end of the crankshaft. No worries, we have a new one, right? And this bearing, yeah, feels terrible too. Feels as bad as the other side. All right, I'm gonna spend a little time cleaning this up, and then we're gonna press these bearings out. I've seen a lot of videos where people use different methods to get these main bearings in, and where they freeze the bearing and heat the case. These are a press fit. I have a press, and I will typically put the bearings in the refrigerator, let them get cool, but I'll press them in. I don't heat the case normally. But let me clean these cases up, and we'll get the new bearings out, and we'll get ready to press those into place. All right, so the next step here to get ready to push these bearings out, we're just going to pop the seals out, and you want to make sure on these seals to know which way they go in, because some of them can be confusing. Some of them look like they have seals like this on both sides. These look pretty self-explanatory, but just be careful when you take your bottom end apart. You look at those seals and make sure, so you can make sure you get the new ones back in the same orientation. We're going to go ahead and pop the counter shaft seal and the shifter shaft seal. Get those out of there. All right, and then depending on how you're doing this and what tools you have at your disposal, like I said, I've seen lots of videos on how people do this. You could heat the case up around the main bearings and drive them out with, sometimes they'll just fall out, but worst case you can drive them out with like a hammer and a socket. I have a press, and we're going to use a press to press these out, but if you don't have a press, there's other ways to get these out. And getting them out is not that difficult really, because you're not trying to save them, but putting them back in, you have to be careful when you put them back in. So let's go press these out, and then we'll work on putting some new ones in. All right, so I've got the case in my press, and I've just used a right-sized 1/2-inch socket, and we're gonna crank the press down and press that bearing out. You want to make sure when you do this that the case is sitting flush on your press. There's dowels sometimes that align the cases, and if you have those dowels in there and the case is not set flat on the press, when you press it down you can damage your cases. So make sure it's flat like that. And here we go. Let's see if we can get this one to come out. They typically come out pretty easy. There it goes. All right, and there's our bearing. The other side is pretty much a repeat of this, so I'm not going to film it, but this is our first bearing. They feel very rough. Definitely needed to be replaced. All right, so installing the bearings is the reverse of the process. I've had this bearing in the refrigerator, in the freezer overnight. That helps with the installation. And we're going to press it in, obviously from the other side. And it's important when you do that that you use something that presses on the outer race. You don't want to press a new bearing in on the inner race. If you do that, you're driving the pressure through the balls, and it can dent and damage the races, and the bearings will fail prematurely. So you always want to drive it in or press it in using the outer race. And so here we go. Let's see if we can get this one to go in. Same thing applies with making sure that your case is flat on your press if you're using a press. And just run it in until it bottoms. And one of our transmission bearings fell out. And so there we have. Our first crank bearing is installed. Feels nice and smooth. And so we're gonna basically repeat this on the other side. Again, I'm not gonna film it, but that's how you would press one in. I suppose you could drive this in with the socket as long as you're working on the outer race and you're careful. You could probably drive this in with a hammer if you needed to, or find some other way to get it pressed into place. Like I said, I've seen videos where people will heat the case and freeze the bearing and they drop right in. I've never had that happen, but I've definitely seen videos where it's done. So that's also an option if you don't have a press. All right, so the next step we're going to do is we're going to put in all of our seals. I like to put the seals in, including counter shaft and shift shaft, before I put the cases together. They can be put in after. I just think it's easier to do it ahead of time. And one of the things I like to do when I'm putting in seals, if you look on a seal, it's got a garter spring on the back side of it right there. And if it's a seal that you have to drive in with a hammer, like we're going to do on this one, it's possible to knock that spring off of the seal when you drive it in. And if the seal's already in place and the spring is knocked off, you don't have any choice but to remove the seal and reinstall the garter spring, and in most cases you're going to ruin the seal when you do that. And so one of the things you can do to stop that from happening is take a little bit of grease and just pack the slot on the back side in a couple of places, and then that way if the spring even starts to come loose, it can't get past the grease and it'll stay in place. We're just going to set our seal in place. We're going to use a seal driver. There's one in place. And here's our other side crank seal. Same thing, a little grease in the slot.
That one just pushed into place by hand. All right, this is our countershaft seal. And then this is our shift shaft seal. All right, so with our cases clean, our main bearings installed, we're ready to pull the crank in. And so just like we use the case splitter to take it apart, we're going to use a special tool to pull the crankshaft into one side of the cases before we reassemble the cases. It doesn't really matter which side you pull it in on. The reassembling the cases is pretty much the same regardless of which side you pull it in on. I'm probably going to pull it in on this side, and then we'll work on getting the cases back together. Okay, so I've put the crankshaft in the case as far as it'll go by hand, and we're going to assemble our crank puller tool. And so basically this tool, we're going to attach this piece to the crankshaft, and then we're going to put this piece over it, and we're going to tighten the nut, and it's going to pull the crankshaft up through the case, pressing against the side of the case. And so it's important when you press in a crankshaft that you don't push it from the opposite side. If you do, you can actually get the crank out of true, and if it's out of true, it's going to vibrate like crazy and not going to last very long. So it's important that you pull this in the right way. So let's assemble our tool and put this piece over and put the nut on. Screw this piece in place. This piece goes on next. Then we use these two rods. And I hope we use these two rods. There we go. And that barely fits. All right, I've only caught about a thread there on the tool, so we're going to have to pull very gently and see if we can get this to come in without damaging the tool. Yeah. And it's important when you pull it in also that you make sure that the rod is lined up with the cylinder. If it's off to the side and you pull the crankshaft in, it's going to bind up and you're going to have a hard time getting that loose. So got to keep that straight, and then I can feel it's going in fairly easily. All right, we're going to run that in until it bottoms like it just did, and then we'll take our tool off. Yeah, hopefully you can hear how quiet, well, I guess hearing quiet is kind of a non-thing, but you can feel how smooth and quiet that is. That's the way it should be. All right, and so now we're going to have to assemble the transmission, and then we're going to have to do the same thing when we pull the other case into the engine. We're going to have to use our puller on this side and pull it together. So let me get a few things together and we'll start that process. All right, so the next step is to get this transmission back in this bike, and these are all the parts that make up the transmission. We have our input shaft, we have our output shaft with a slightly damaged spline. That looks pretty sketchy. We have these two shafts that the gear selector, the shift forks slide on, and we have our shift drum, and those all have to fit inside this case. And so here's how I put it together. I'm sure, like most things, everybody has their process. This is how I do it. All right, so let's see if we can put this transmission in. So when I put it in, I like to put the transmission together, all the gears in place, and slide these two shafts into the case together. These should slide in by hand. However, with our damaged output shaft, we may have to coax it a little bit, but let's see what happens. We just slide this together. Oh, yeah. And here we are all the way in. You can usually tell if both shafts are all the way in because these two gears should pretty much line up. The flush on this edge. It may be off just a little bit, but it shouldn't be off by too much. So yeah, I think we're all the way in. And so now we have to get the shift mechanism in place. And these three forks have letters on them. There's a C, and there's an L, and there's an R, and those go left, right, and center. And so one of the shafts, the output shaft, typically will have two places for a shift fork, and the input shaft will only have one. And so we're going to put the first one, this is the center one, is going to go on the input shaft. So we're going to put it in its slot where it goes, and then just move it off to the side. And then we're going to take the L fork. This is the L fork, and it's going to go in the bottom shifter groove on the output shaft. And we're going to move it off to the side. And then this is the R fork. It's going to go on the upper shaft. Then once you have those in place, you can set the shift drum in place. And then you bring each fork over to its respective slot in the fork and put the shaft in place. This one's going to go up here. I can't see. Sometimes it takes a little finagling to get all of this to go together. There we go. All right, and once you have the shafts in place, that's basically it. There's our transmission reassembled. So the next thing we need to do, put the other case on. All right, so let's set our another case side in place. There we go. And then we're going to reassemble our tool. And so in this case, we're going to use a bolt here in the end of the crankshaft. All right. Make sure everything's looking lined up. We're going to start slowly pulling the cases together. So our shift drum is coming up in its bearing. Transmission shafts are in their bearings. All right, that all looks good. We're going to take our tool off. All right, there we have our engine case together. Now, that's so smooth and quiet. That's the way it should be. All right, so these we'll cut these gaskets off after we've tightened the case screws. So yeah, so we have a couple of really long ones, but you can see, like you see when you put that screw in, how much free screw there is. That's too much. It shouldn't be that high. So more like that. So that's where that screw goes. They should all be about the same height when you get them put in place. And I left the case just a little bit loose in case we had the gasket was in the way for any of these screws. Now that one goes in there. All right, let's tighten those down. Now I'm going to start with the screws right around the crankshaft. Make sure we get all of that pulled together good. All right, I'm going to torque those screws down with a torque wrench, but I need to look up the spec. All right, so the torque on those is 7 foot-pounds, which is about 90 inch-pounds. And so I'm going to just go about half of that to start with. It's a little bit more than half. All right. All right. All right, everything's feeling really good there. So I think we'll call it a day for today, and we'll come back, we'll put the magneto together, and we'll have to reassemble this whole right side. This is going to be interesting when we do this side because we didn't take it apart. I didn't take it apart anyway. and so there's no telling what I may find as far as missing parts. But we'll see. We'll see tomorrow when we get ready to put this back together the rest of the way. But, yep.
All right, so I've decided to end this video here as a part 1. We're going to do a part 2 where we finish this engine. We've gotten a lot of work done already. We have the main bearings pressed into place. We have the crankshaft installed. The cases are put back together and everything's going well, but we have a lot of work left to do, and this video is already getting long. So we're going to do a part 2 where we're going to finish the right side assembly of the engine, and we're going to do the top end. So I hope you've enjoyed the video so far. If you have, please like and subscribe, and check my playlist. There's going to be more videos out there about small engine repair, including the part 2 for this engine rebuild, this CR125 engine rebuild. So again, thanks for watching, and stay tuned. We'll see you on the next video. We'll see you on part 2.